What I'd like to do, I have a couple of things that I need to hand out to you for my benefit. One is just an email and listening challenge, which I'll explain here in a minute. And the other is an evaluation form that if you would fill this out for me, this has nothing to do with the idea series, this is just me personally. Okay, because I'm a poet, and I understand poetry is sometimes intimidating, but it certainly doesn't have to be intimidating. I know a lot of you are more visual artists than maybe writing artists, but I think that it's all very related. And in fact, the work I do really heavily depends on vision and the seeing, the art of seeing. I've been involved recently in a group called Poetry for Personal Power that was started by a woman in Kansas City named Corinna West. And Corinna West got involved in writing to sort of save her own life. She had survived 12 psychiatric diagnoses, 29 psychiatric medicines, up to 6 at a time, 5 hospitalizations, 6 suicide attempts, and 7 electroshock treatments. So she decided at this point that she needed to get out of the mental care healthcare system and start taking care of herself. And she discovered creative writing as a method for doing that. Thinking about that goal of healing through writing, and then thinking about the theme of this conference of collective memory, I'm thinking, how can we use our personal stories, which is what Rona was just basically talking about, not just for inspiration, but for healing ourselves and others and even the world. So I have a handout that has some writing prompts. We are not going to get to all of this stuff, which is why I made the handout, because this is everything I wanted to say and I knew I wasn't going to have time to say. So I'm going to pass those out. And I'm going to start by reading you one of my poems, if I can find the second sheet of it. Dang it. I knew this was going to happen. Okay, well, I'm going to read you part of this poem. That's not it. And then I'm going to talk about some of these writing prompts a little bit. So this poem is called Galveston. The last time I remember talking to you, you were wearing your purple silk dress, your white hair twisted by the wind that seemed would blow you over. You had the little rocking chair in your hand, and you asked me why Helen was stealing your things, why my dad wouldn't let you go home. I was 12. There was nothing I could do but carry the chair and take you home with me. The guest bed closer to your home than the house you owned and shared with my other Grandma Helen. The last time I saw you, my mother was wearing a red dress. She said it was your happy day. You were free, no longer confused, no longer afraid. One day I was racked with sorrow and confusion, my marriage flying to pieces, my heart in chunks of ash and ice and searing pain and helpless. I saw an old woman in the parking lot of King Soopers holding a bag of groceries. She looked lost. The wind rocked her. I went around the block and came back to ask if she needed help, and you looked out of her eyes and told me everything would be all right. So as you can see, this poem takes a lot from my own life. And you may be wondering why it's called Galveston. That's the part of the poem that I don't actually have with me. And that part of the poem is based on some family photos that I have of my grandmothers when they were young women. My grandmother, the one that in this poem, spent a lot of time in Galveston when she was a young woman, and they've got pictures of themselves playing on the beach in their like frilly sleeved swimming suits with the skirts and the ruffled necklines and stuff, and pictures of Thanksgiving celebrations. And what's cool for me looking at these old sepia tone pictures from the 1930s and 40s is that's my face. You know, I'm the person in those photos. And so this poem is about that sort of confluence of memory, and it ends with the idea that your bones remember who you are, even when you've forgotten because of the trauma that you're going through and whatever your daily life is. I also started thinking about this theme of memory. Last weekend, I went to a concert by Arlo Guthrie. I don't know if you will have heard of Arlo Guthrie. Arlo Guthrie is the son of Woody Guthrie, who was a roustabout folk singer in the 20s and 30s. And he wrote the song, This Land Is Your Land, which I'm sure you all know. This land is your land. Okay, so Woody Guthrie wrote that song. And he wrote it based on his experiences of traveling around the United States as basically a bum-type character. And so that's why he talks about the Endless Highway and the Ribbon of Skyway and all that kind of stuff. So Arlo Guthrie and his daughter, Sarah Lee, were both at the concert, and they were talking about their family stories. And one of their family stories is about Woody Guthrie. Hey, Dad. Dad wrote this song, and this was Arlo Guthrie's earliest memories are of his dad singing this song to him. Okay, so now that song has gone from being Woody Guthrie's experiences and Arlo Guthrie's fuzzy, my dad sang this song to me when I was a baby, to collective memory, because you guys all know that song. They sing that song in the United States. They sing it with a slightly different set of lyrics in Canada. They sing it in China with a different set of lyrics. So that's that piece of family memory that Woody Guthrie jotted down in his little notebook has become part of our collective culture worldwide, not just in the United States. So not everything that you write has to become part of collective culture, but the act of making art is deeply personal and influenced by your own stories and your own history, the way we've just been talking about with Rona's introduction. But by the act of putting it out there, by the act of putting it forth, publishing it, hanging it in a gallery, reading it out loud in a group of strangers or whatever, it becomes part of that collective memory. The other thing you'll notice from listening to that first poem and from looking at some of the poems in the handbook is that when it becomes art, it doesn't have to be journalistic. I teach journalism. And so in journalism, I'm always talking about being objective and sticking to the facts and being accurate and documenting everything. When I write my creative work, I don't worry about that. I don't mind saying that the kid in the 1940s picture is my grandchild, which is, of course, in reality is impossible. But I'm talking about something that's a deeper kind of reality, the reality that underlays our everyday world, where we are all connected, where we all are composed of atoms that are merging into each other all the time. So that's part of the collective memory. So what I've done in the handout is I've given you some prompts and some poems to sort of jog your minds and get you to think about your own life in a different way. I'm also asking you to free associate and just write what happens. And there are different types of prompts. One of them is to find a photograph, like the photographs of my grandmother in Galveston. And just start by describing what's happening in that photo, but let your mind go wild from there. Don't worry about sticking to the real truth of the matter. The second prompt here, describe an event using as much sensory detail as possible. This poem was my very first poem to get published. It was published in the Little Balkans Review. And it really is just a description of what happens, but the language that you choose and the emotion that you bring to it can elevate that from a journalistic report of we hitchhiked and then we camped, to a poem. So I'm going to read this one real quick, and then I'm going to move on. It's called Avaberry. Avaberry is a standing stone circle like Stonehenge, but much smaller, but possibly older, in England. We tramped until the sky turned purple and the sheep glowed like ghosts among the standing stones. We fenced crazily with tent poles, then went inside to sleep next to the barrows of dead kings. And I said, what if our souls were unattached and watching us? Pretty simple. It's just a moment. I don't know. I like it. The next prompt is something that you visual artists might really enjoy. Think of a color, and then free associate images that relate to that color, and then list them. This poem is called Thinking in Blue. I wrote it when a friend of mine was in the hospital, and I was really depressed about this. But I decided that if I were going to think blue thoughts, they would be positive blue thoughts. So I tried to write down all the blue things that would make me happy. And I feel like it does sort of tell a story if you read through it. I'm not going to take the time to read this one in class, but it's got images in it that relate and that can be seen as telling a story. The next prompt is one I got from a book called Writing Alone and with Others. And this is one that I think would be really great for somebody who is trying to overcome adversity through creative writing, through journaling or something like that. And the author, Pat Snyder, says, what's your earliest memory? What's the first time in your life that you remember being a person distinct from the rest of the world? And if you think of my Ava Berry poem, I don't think I've ever thought of myself as a person distinct from the world. I think of myself as a person interacting with the world. But my first memory is when I was about 2.5 and my parents were moving us from Illinois to Pittsburgh. And in my memory, I'm like on the back shelf of the car on the back window looking out at the road as we're driving. And so I've always thought that that was really significant as to who I've become, that my earliest memory is traveling. And so if I were to write about that, which I have not done yet, which I also think is kind of interesting that I wouldn't have written about that, I would be thinking about what is it that I'm seeing? What is the visual image that I'm seeing? And then I would go back and add the other senses, which is the last thing I'm going to talk about here in a minute or two. The next prompt is taking a journal and gathering information from that. So if you keep a journal, it can be any kind of a journal. It can be just like a date book that you've jotted notes in about what you did that day. Just flip through that and see if anything jumps out at you as something that you want to write about. And I've given you an example that's not from my own life. It's actually from William Wordsworth. It's his famous poem about daffodils called I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. Are you guys familiar with that poem? I will go ahead and read it just for fun. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. So when you read a poet like William Wordsworth, you might wonder where he gets his inspiration. I know whenever I've gone to readings of other writers, or whenever I have given a reading, one of the questions they always ask, and you can probably testify this, is where do you get your ideas?
Is that a real poem, or did you write it yourself?
Nobody has asked me that, but I would have a hard time with that one. But people ask where we get our ideas. Well, again, ideas are all around us too. I mean, everything is connected. If you're paying attention, you probably have ideas. My journalist students ask me this question too. What do I write about? Where am I going to find an idea for a story? And I'm like, look around. What are you upset about? What are you angry about? What's going on? What do you see? What makes you go, what's happening there? Ask about it. We were at a restaurant in Miami, Oklahoma, and a couple of people came in dressed in 1800s garb. And I said to my students, I said, hey, what do you think's going on with them? And they're all like, well, I don't know. And I said, go ask them. And they're like, we can't just go and ask them. They're strangers. And I said, look, they're dressed in 1880 garb in Miami, Oklahoma. They are expecting people to come up and talk to them. And you guys are journalists, and it's your job. So they did. And we found out that they were getting ready to give a program. But one of the ways that Wordsworth got his ideas, we all think of William Wordsworth as one of the great poets of British literature, and we think that he was spending all his time getting these great inspirations and writing these stories. Well, he actually got this idea from his sister Dorothy's journal. And her journals have since been published, and there's a lot of things in her journal that you'll see showing up in his poems. Now, that doesn't mean that he wasn't also there at these events, but he used her journals as a reference to kind of start his ideas and to remind him of what it was he wanted to say. But again, he didn't necessarily stick to the facts. He made the day a different type of day than it was in her description. And so I've included an excerpt from her journal where she talks about this. But she says the wind was furious. And in the poem, it doesn't sound like the wind was furious. It sounds like it was just a gay dancing breeze kind of thing. The lake was rough. She says the wind seized our breath. But then she talks about the fact that they saw these daffodils. And she says, when we were in the woods beyond Galboa Park, we saw a few daffodils close to the waterside. We fancied that the lake had floated the seeds ashore and the little colony had so sprung up. But as we went along, there were more and yet more, and at last under the boughs of the trees we saw that there was a long belt of them along the shore, about the breadth of a country turnpike road. I never saw daffodils so beautiful. They grew among the mossy stones about and about them. Some rested their heads upon these stones as on a pillow for weariness, and the rest tossed and reeled and danced and seemed as if they verily laughed with the wind that blew upon them over the lake. They looked so gay, ever glancing, ever changing. So this is the root of Wordsworth's inspiration for that poem. And then he has transformed it into art, and now we all know it. It's part of our collective memory. So these are ideas for generating words. And you don't have to generate good words, and it doesn't have to be Wordsworth the first time. I'm sure Wordsworth wasn't the Wordsworth the first time he tried to write something either. But the next step becomes revision. And the process of writing is all about the process of revision. The process of generating ideas is the part where your mind just wanders and makes connections and your synapses snap and things happen and it's magic and it's really cool. And then you go back and you look at what you've got and start trying to figure out how to make it better. So I've given you some tips on revising these word generations or these journal entries or whatever into art. Once you've completed this initial piece of writing, you want to let it sit for a while. A week is good. A few hours will work. Just enough time for you to really think about it. And I personally like to walk while I'm thinking, and walking somehow puts that rhythm into my body. It embodies rhythm in a way that makes it easier for me to put it on the page. And so then I have other ideas, and I come back to the piece, and I read through it, and maybe I'm happy with it, and maybe I'm not, and maybe I'm happy with it today, and 5 years from now I'm going to read it and go, this could lead to some editing, which is what I think of my Galveston poem right now. But then I'll take that piece of writing, that journal entry or whatever, and I'll start circling the images that jump out at me. Any phrase, any word, any image. So looking at Dorothy Wordsworth's journal, I might have circled those phrases about the daffodils. I might have circled certain words, like the word gay appears in her entry and in the poem. The image of the daffodils dancing appears in both the poem and the journal entry. So I'm circling those. And then I'll take those words and I'll put them to the side and maybe try and think about them as a poem or as a piece of writing themselves. The next thing I'm going to do is maybe use a different color of ink, and I'm going to circle all the verbs. And then I'm going to think about the verbs, and I'm going to try and come up with verbs that are stronger and more active and more interesting. Any verb that has an ing on it, I'm going to try and replace with something stronger. Any verb that's a form of to be, I'm going to try and get rid of and use a stronger verb, a more descriptive word. I want every word in my final piece to be really working hard to pull the message that I'm trying to get. Okay, so the last step is going to be, and maybe I'm waiting a week between each one of these steps and letting the poem sort of marinate in its own juice until it gets all that spices into it. And then I'm going to go back and I'm going to see if there are places where I can add sensory detail. Can I make it more descriptive? Can I add more detail that's going to make you feel it or see it or smell it or taste it or whatever? I tend to be real visual, so a lot of my poems have visual image. I do not have a good sense of smell, so I don't have a lot of sensory smelling imagery in my poems. That's one thing I try to add back sometimes, deliberately. I do some taste. Okay, so the last thing I have in my packet is an example of a free write that I did, and then the poem that came out of it. And if you look at the free write, you can see that I've highlighted in yellow and blue 2 sections. The yellow is the section, the sentences that I came out of this whole long free write of, this is the core of what I'm trying to say in this piece. So I take those out and I put them over here and I start writing the poem around them. The line in blue is a line that ends up in the poem also. But all the rest of this, like 2 long paragraphs of rambling, and it's sort of an angry rant, all of that is not going to show up in the poem. And I have to say also that I almost never show people my raw writing like this, so I feel very brave for having done that. And when you read it, you're going to go, this is crap. What is she talking about? Why is she so angry and bitter? But the idea is that this free write is a way to get at what I'm really trying to say. So what am I really trying to say, and how is it benefiting the world? How is it adding to our collective memory in a way that's positive and is going to move us forward? And so the free write is about being tired. I was really irritated. I was at an all-day workshop, and one of the people in the audience was very irritating to me. And so this starts out as a reaction to the stuff that she had said that ticked me off. And then it gets into the fact that what I'm irritated about is this dichotomy that people are trying to force on the world of us versus them, and how that's not helpful. And it doesn't become helpful if you just flip who gets to be us and who gets to be them. I mean, Dr. Seuss wrote the story about the Sneetches, and that so 50 years ago, we should have learned this lesson, and we're still talking about it. So yes, I'm a little ticked off. And so I wrote a poem, and the first draft was just those couple of lines. The second draft starts bringing in what was happening at the moment, the things that I was concerned about that day. And that happened to be the situation with the Syrian refugees coming into Europe. So I'm going to go ahead and read this. This poem is called Election Year. And this is going to be my last thing here. Back home, the candidates are talking about building walls. The police complain that everyone hates them. In Hungary, they're erecting razor wire. Dazed refugees stumble across another border. They've pulled dead children from the churning surf. Now they reach for bottles of water, bread, a place to rest. Government troops push them onwards. They're someone else's problem now. Across the indigo waters of the strait, those immigrants crossed in leaky boats. Men smash white marble monuments, erasing this inconvenient history, warped mirror of the stone saints Cromwell's men beheaded half a millennia ago. Flipping us and them doesn't heal our fresh-made wounds. Blinding another man won't give me back my sight. Have we collectively learned nothing that can hold us up, all of us, without requiring that someone else be ground down? What if we lifted our faces from the texts of ancient books? Instead of arguing whose God is supreme, what if we looked into one another's eyes? What if I offered you a juicy peach? What if we then clasped each other's sweet, sticky palms? What if, together, we carried the children, the grandmothers, the babies to safety? So this is why I didn't tell a story for Rona, because I was telling all of my creative inspiration in my presentation. So thank you.